Hey guys, Uncommon Ramen here. Today for TCG Tuesday, I had a person in my comments ask for a deck list for the Lynde Cheerful Tormentor commander deck after I had done the video kind of as a spotlight on Lynde Cheerful Tormentor. And I hadn't actually had a deck list put together at the time, though I was working on it. So I decided to put something together. I want to keep something as kind of a disclaimer in mind here, that the deck that I've created is definitely more along the lines of casual, and it is because the group that I play with plays on a more casual level, and a lot of the people in my group play pre-constructed commander decks that you can buy off the shelf, and so I didn't want to create a deck that was going to just completely shut out my opponents. I wanted to create something that was kind of on a similar power level, if not just a little bit higher. So the reason I bring that disclaimer up is because I want to do an honorable mentions part to this video before I go into the actual deck list. And the honorable mentions are by no means cards that are worse than cards that I've chosen for the deck. They actually are kind of on the opposite end. A lot of the honorable mentions are just downright too good, and they would outright shut out my opponents just because of the decks they've chosen to play. And I didn't want to play like that. I wanted to play something that was more casual fun and obviously not nearly optimized. To give you an example, I am running every version of Nicol Bolas, and there's really no reason to do so. So let me talk about, again, Lynde Cheerful Tormentor so we can get a clearer picture of what we're looking at here. The Cheerful Tormentor is a 2/4 blue-black-red commander that has Death Touch, and whenever a curse is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you can return to the battlefield attached to you at the beginning of your next end step, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, you may attach a curse attached to you to one of your opponents, and if you do so, you get to draw 2 cards. So the idea behind this is to run curse heavy and try and get as many curses out there, and then recycle those curses as they get dealt with. So this is the idea behind the deck, and the theme, or I guess the theme that I chose to go with. Like I said, more casual. We ran Nicol Bolas. We're running very heavy enchantments, and a lot of the cards that would be considered more competitive EDH style cards that should go in the deck, I'm not really running because I just don't think that they fit with the group that I'm playing, and they don't fit in a casual deck. So let's look at the honorable mentions, and some of these honorable mentions are not in here because of theme. Some of them are not in here because they're just downright too good, and some of them are not in here just because I couldn't figure out how to put them in without cutting certain cards, and having not play tested the deck, I don't know what to cut just yet. So you might see a new deck list for this down the road, but this is what I'm working with right now. So let's take a look at the honorable mentions. We're going to start with some of the spot removal that I did not put in this deck. We have things like Reality Shift, Feed the Swarm, and Terminate, as well as Counter Squall. So to talk on this, a big part of the reason that some spot removal didn't make it into the deck is because it was limited. A lot of the spot removal I chose for the deck was versatile in the fact that it could destroy more than one type of permanent. So it could destroy creatures, it could destroy artifacts, enchantments, so on and so forth. And I wanted to be able to make sure that for the limited amount of spots that I had for that kind of thing, that there was a versatility to it, so that I'm not cornering myself against certain decks. So Counter Squall is great against non-creature spells, and I have I believe one counter in here that already is along that lines that I just thought was downright better. So we'll see it as we go through. But Counter Squall just ended up in the honorable mentions. If I find myself in a position where I need more counter magic, I definitely will look to this one as opposed to cards like Negate. Terminate was not put in here because it only destroys a creature, and I found a card that was just downright better, which again you'll see as we go through. Feed the Swarm I did not put in here, as well as Reality Shift, for the biggest reason being that I'm running every copy of Nicol Bolas, and each of those copies of Nicol Bolas has some way of doing some sort of removal. And because I was working with limited spots, I decided that the removal that I could get from Nicol Bolas, excuse me, was going to have to suffice for what I have available. So it's not as if I'm not running spot removal. It's just that I have chosen to be super inefficient and run Nicol Bolas in every form, and therefore I would like to utilize his abilities. Next up, we have something called Solemn Simulacrum. This is not a new card. It is definitely much older, as far back as I believe Mirrodin, or a little bit later. I'm not 100% sure. I don't remember. But the reason that this didn't go into the deck is because it just didn't fit the theme well enough. And I'm hoping to utilize the artifact, the mana rocks that I have in here, to kind of substitute for the fact that this kind of fetches for a land. And the reason that I just didn't see this one as valuable as I guess it could be is because it only fetches for the basic land, and it does, when it dies, allow you to draw a card. But as we go through the deck, I had a very difficult time finding a home for it in there. So it's definitely on my honorable mentions. And if you are running a competitive EDH deck, I would definitely choose this. You know, this is an incredible card. But I really had other things in mind, and it just didn't fit the theme very well. So next up we have Sanguine Bond, and this was supposed to go up with Exquisite Blood, but before I was about to spend close to $40 on Exquisite Blood, I had to decide whether I was going to be able to fit it in the deck. And what I came down to was that while both of them are enchantments and they fit perfectly with the theme and they're both black, the reality is that once you've played it, that is pretty much the game. Once one life loss happens, it goes into an infinite loop, and whatever opponent lost the life instantly dies. And when I was considering this, I decided that this was a little bit too unfair. And while, again, I would say if you're running this and you want to run it competitively, you should probably run the Sanguine Bond with the Exquisite Blood, because you have a lot of artifact recursion in this deck. Obviously not with Lynde, because this isn't a curse, but just in general. And for sure the infinite loop is a great way to get a win condition. But again, it just didn't make it into the deck because it was just too good, and I really wanted to focus around something more casual. Next up, we have Nightscape Familiar. Now, Nightscape Familiar, I only switched it out because I found a card that I felt fit better, and we'll hit that card when we go through. You may or may not agree with me. Just, hit me up in the comments there. Then we have a bunch of cards with constellations. So we have things like Thoughtrender Lamia, Grim Guardian, Forgeborn Oreads, and Agent of Erebos. So the reason that these cards did not necessarily make the cut is because if you read Constellation very carefully, it says whenever an enchantment or this particular permanent enters the battlefield under your control. Now, it's not that those permanents aren't going to come back under your control with Lynde. So as my curses are being destroyed, Lynde is going to pop them back into play under my control, which means that the constellation effect will happen. But the thing is that, again, like I mentioned earlier, I am actually playing against casual decks, and a lot of these casual decks don't have massive enchantment removal. So while I do expect Lynde to have some effects where I'm going to get a couple of my curses back every now and then, I don't see it happening on a massive level, and therefore I don't see these triggering as often as I'd like to see them. Again, if I was in a more competitive place, or I knew that my opponents were running heavy enchantment destruction, and therefore I could bank off of Lynde bringing those enchantments back into play under my control, I would definitely run these over a lot of cards that I have chosen. But because it's so specific, I had to pass up on this. And you can see they range from dealing 1 damage to exiling graveyards to loss of life to discarding a card. So and one of these, the Agent of Erebos, is still a possibility if I can find room for it, just because the exiling of graveyards is such a powerful ability and it's so lucrative in Commander. So just, it's on the honorable mentions for now. It may come back. One of the draw cards that I chose to put on the honorable mentions was Thirst for Meaning, because I found a card that I felt was a better fit. And while you should have enchantments in your hand, I don't necessarily want those enchantments to go to my graveyard. I'd rather have them in play. So, you know, I think the other one is just a better choice for now. I also have a board wipe in my honorable mentions, Chain Reaction. There isn't a lot in the way of board wipes that are effective under red. That don't cost an arm and a leg. And while black has a lot of effective board wipes, again, they tend to cost more. I also have a second board wipe-ish card in the black color that you'll see in my honorable mentions. But again, I'm focusing more on the enchantment side of things, and I'm hoping that the curses can kind of help mitigate the field. So Chain Reaction didn't make it in over another board wipe that I felt was just more effective. I also have a couple of cards that are copy cards. Spark Double, actually all 3 of these I would love to play. I'm just having a hard time figuring out how to fit them. And again, these are those cards that I would like to play test the deck first, to see what I consider to be kind of dead cards and replace as I go. But we have things like Spark Double, which is going to copy a creature or planeswalker. So this potentially could be another Nicol Bolas. It could potentially be another one of my creatures that helps me synergize with my enchantments. It also could copy Lynde if it wanted to, so I could have more abilities to recycle curses. But I'm not sure exactly how I want to fit this yet. Next up, we have the Protean Thaumaturge. This one has the Constellation ability, so yes, the enchantments have to enter play under my control. But this one, it doesn't necessarily have to trigger often, and when it does trigger, it copies another creature, so it can help to throw some big blockers in play, or just help to create a solid board. Again, this is one of those that I would love to put into play. I just have to figure out how to fit this in my deck. And then finally, we have Clever Impersonator, and probably this one is the most important of the group, because Clever Impersonator enters the battlefield as a copy of any non-land permanent, so it can potentially come in as one of your curses. And I want this in there, but you're going to see another card that I put in that I wanted to put in the deck that I just didn't, because it's not a curse and it's not an enchantment. And so at the end of the day, if it's in my graveyard, I cannot fetch it back with Lynde. So I had to make some sacrifices that were really tough choices. Amongst those sacrifices, we have Role Reversal. So Role Reversal is really good, except that I'm exchanging 2 permanents of the same type. So I would have to be exchanging one of my curses that I ended up getting back on me because of Lynde for one of their enchantments. And again, when I'm playing in the casual Arena and I'm playing with people that are possibly playing pre-constructed commander decks, a lot of those enchantment targets aren't necessarily always useful to me, and so I found something that I felt was just a better fit. On top of that, we are going to have the Tutor Suite. Vampiric Tutor is up there with that. I did not want to spend the money on the Vampiric Tutor if I didn't think I was going to end up fitting it in the deck. And what I came to the conclusion of was that these are just too good. And they are just definitely auto includes in any decks that are running black, because they will increase the consistency of your deck. But again, since I am running in the casual format, I just didn't see a way that I could put these in without it being extremely unfair and just really one-sided, and I decided that I didn't want to do that. So this is another one of those cards where I'm saying you should definitely run these, but for a competitive reason. If you're running casual, I mean, you can do it, but you're probably going to make your opponents pretty mad. So we got things like Profane Tutor, Demonic Tutor, and Grim Tutor, and obviously on that list, we also have the Vampiric Tutor. Again, I just felt like they were too good. Next up, we have Kazakar, the Eye Tyrant. This one is really good for that political intrigue, monarch type of deck that this kind of leans towards, because you're trying to give your permanents away. But at the end of the day, it didn't fit well enough into the theme that I was creating here, and so instead of running it, I chose to keep this out of the deck. Mirror Maid, as well as Copy Enchantment, or whatever the enchantment version of Copy Artifact is, didn't make it into the deck because it's not a curse. It's just an enchantment, and I have much more limited ways of bringing this back from the graveyard than I do with regular curses. So while I wanted to run this, it was very difficult to find a reason to keep it in, especially considering the deck has 29 curses in it. Next up, we have Sphinx of the Second Sun, and this one definitely is one that I'm trying to find room for, and it's up with those copy cards where I'm going to find room as I find the dead cards in the deck, because this allows you to have a secondary beginning phase, which includes your untap, upkeep, and draw phase. And I think that's really important with a card like Lynde, because it allows the upkeep phase to happen again, which means that you can recycle 2 curses. Another reason why I chose to keep this one out as opposed to putting it in was because at the end of the day, it isn't in a casual format. They're not going to be destroying enchantments as quickly, so I didn't see as much of a need to offload curses. And again, I have a lot of other cards that I chose instead of it that I felt were better choices. Next up, we have Archetype of Imagination. This one was just too good. Taking away flying from your opponent and allowing them not to gain it, and then on top of that, all of your creatures gain flying. It makes it so that your opponents can't play Magic, and it can easily make a shutout in a game. So this, while I think it should be an auto include because it's definitely also an enchantment, I think that it would make things a little too unfair, so I chose not to include it. And that is also the case with this one, Opposition Agent, because Opposition Agent effectively nullifies tutors, as well as ramp. And while it definitely is 100% auto-include in any deck that is running black, I just felt like it was too powerful, and I just didn't want to do that. Next up, we have Archfiend of Depravity. This was the black board wipe that I chose to go with in lieu of things like Damnation, Toxic Deluge, or Meat Hook Massacre, because it was just absolutely cheaper. And in the end, I chose not to run it, just simply because, again, I'd like to see how the deck runs, find where my dead cards are, and then kind of figure out if there's room for it. Propaganda is the same way. Propaganda is just an effective way to keep your opponent from attacking you, but in late game it becomes less and less effective. So I chose to cut it for now and then kind of see where we go. And as we go through the deck, you're going to kind of see some of the other cards that I chose to help mitigate attacks. And maybe you might think they're better. If not, just leave comments below. We can work with that. Next up, we have Blightcaster. This one was a difficult choice for me. But I think the card that I chose in place of it is going to be a little bit more effective against some of these pre-constructed decks, as opposed to putting -2/-2 onto a target creature. I'm looking at something more of a blanket effect, so this one just couldn't make it in. And I like I said, as I find dead cards, I'll probably find ways to include it. Next up, we have Blood Aspirant, and the reason I wanted to use Blood Aspirant is because you have a way to sacrifice a creature enchantment, so you can sacrifice your curses as they get attached to you, and in doing so, you give Blood Aspirant a +1/+1 counter. But Blood Aspirant is too vulnerable to spot removal that it made me kind of want to turn my attention towards other cards that I felt had better effects in the long run. Amongst some of those cards, we have Bontu, God Eternal Bontu. Again, this one doesn't have a reoccurring sacrifice effect, and once it has happened, that's kind of it. It just becomes a 5/6 body with menace. And while that is nothing to shrug at, we're talking about Commander. I'm just having a hard time seeing if this will actually fit in the deck. Another shocker for me that I didn't end up putting in was Claws of Gix. This one is one that may go in if I can find some dead cards to remove for it. Because the idea of sacrificing a permanent allows me to sacrifice the curses that get attached to me, especially the ones that I can't figure out how to attach to my opponents. But the gaining 1 life is kind of trivial in Commander, so we'll see what happens. Last on the honorable mentions was Crystal Chimes. Because my opponents don't typically have a lot in the way of enchantment removal, the idea of bringing back a massive amount of enchantments seemed like it wasn't necessarily going to be that effective by comparison to the card I did choose in its place. So it's an honorable mention. It's a darn good card, and if your opponents are definitely running mass removal of enchantments, you're going to want to run this card. I just felt like I picked a better card in its place. So without further ado, we're going to take a look first at the land base. Again, I ran casual, so the lands I chose in here are not optimal. I would rather have chosen other cards, but A, they cost too much, and B, I wanted to run something less intimidating. So we're going to start with basic lands. We have 3 islands, 3 mountains, and 3 swamps. As kind of just, you need basics. Those were my basics that I chose. Now, we have Fetid Pools, a bicycle land. Blue-black, it has land types, and that was really important to me. We have Tainted Isle. Tainted Isle is up there. Tainted Isle is better, in my opinion, than the bicycle land, so just keep that in mind. We have Drowned Catacombs, check land, so that's why land types matter. We have Watery Grave, Shockland, land types, it just matters. We have Sunken Hollow, which has land types, and it checks for lands. This one is less likely to be effective because I'm not running that many basic lands, but that's just how it works. And then, of course, we're running Temple of Deceit because it's just a cheap blue-black that is available. Then we have Smoldering Marsh, which is, again, similar to the, what was it called? The Sunken Hollow. We have Blood Crypt, the Shockland with land types. We have Dragonskull Summit, the check land that checks for land types. We have Temple of Deceit, same thing. We have Tainted Peak, again, better than things like the Temple of Deceit and the Bicycle Land, so on and so forth. We have Canyon Sloth, which is a bicycle land. We have Temple of Epiphany, and keep in mind that enemy color lands are a lot harder to come by because they didn't make a lot of them. So we have Temple of Epiphany. We have Sulphur Falls, the one that checks for land types. And then we have Steam Vents, which is Shockland and land types. And then in our colorless slot, we're going to have Blast Zone, which can function as a board wipe. It will help to force my opponents to be very careful about how they play because they're going to see it on the table. And it's just a really interesting land to have. And then we have Reliquary Tower. We're going to be drawing a lot of cards. A lot of these curses allow you to draw cards, and then there's some things that I've put in here that allow you to draw more cards, so Reliquary Tower isn't necessary. In our multicolor lands, we're going to have Exotic Orchard, because likely your opponent's going to be playing at least one color that you're playing, and if not, oh well, at least you have land. We have Forbidden Orchard. There's not a whole lot of reason not to play this. Yes, it gives your opponent a 1/1 token, but at the same time it's just a 1/1 token. So we have Mana Confluence, which is among some of the more expensive lands that I played in here. It's just a land that creates any color for pain. We have Grand Colosseum, same thing, any color for pain, except it comes into play tapped. I'm hoping that doesn't bite me in the butt. And then we have City of Brass, which is the same thing as Grand Colosseum, except that it doesn't come into play tapped. It's just downright better. And then we have Rainbow Veil. Rainbow Veil is strictly in here because I'm trying to have my opponents control as many of the cards that I own as possible for, well, you'll see why. And then last we have lands that create only the 3 colors of my commander. So we have Crypt of the Eternals, which is just a strictly better version of Crumbling Necropolis because it doesn't come into play tapped, and when it comes into play you gain a life. Both of these create the blue, black, red. And then we have Path of Ancestry. We're not running a whole lot of creatures here, but Path of Ancestry creates a color of whatever your color identity is, and so it's just a very good card. And then last but not least, obviously, we have Command Tower. Next, we're going to go into our curses. We are missing a single curse in here. Curse of Opulence, as it were, because Curse of Opulence is expensive, and I haven't pulled the trigger on it. I think it's like a $12 curse. I will eventually pick it up. So in here, we're running every curse that's available except, obviously, Curse of Opulence. So we have Curse of Inertia, Maddening Hex, Curse of Bloodletting, Curse of the Pierced Heart, Curse of Chaos, Curse of Leeches, which transforms into Leeching Lurker, which is just a lifelink Nightbound, so it can be a great creature for you. We have Curse of Fool's Wisdom. Try and get that glare out of here. We have Curse of Echoes. We have Curse of Surveillance. Curse of Oblivion. Curse of the Bloody Tome. Curse of Vengeance. Curse of the Restless Dead. Curse of the Nightly Hunt, which I chose to include. We'll see the reasons why later. This one can be very dangerous. Curse of Misfortunes. Curse of Verbosity. Curse of Disturbance. Trespasser's Curse. Curse of Obsession. Fraying Sanity. Torment of Scarabs. Cruel Reality. Curse of Shallow Graves. Curse of Thirst. Curse of Stalked Prey. Curse of Shaken Faith. Curse of Death's Hold. And finally, Curse of Unbinding. So these are the curses that I'm running. Eventually, I will have Curse of Opulence in there as well. I am running the entire set of curses, just so I can utilize Lynde's ability as best I can. Next up, we're going to take a look at other enchantments that I chose to include. We have Puka's Mischief, which I felt was just better than Role Reversal. Because A, it's an enchantment, B, it's going to trigger every upkeep, which helps me to get rid of curses that are attached to me that I wasn't able to attach via Lynde. And C, because it allows me to take control of an opponent's permanent of equal or lesser value, which is a lot more freeing than Role Reversal, which requires you to take a permanent of the same type. Next, we have Megrim. Megrim is in here because I intend to have my opponents discard cards. Every version of Nicol Bolas has some version of discarding cards, as well as several of the curses. I just feel like this is a great way to close up life gaps. Next, we have Captive Audience. Captive Audience is as close to a curse without being a curse as I can get. Captive Audience is another permanent that I own that will be under my opponent's control, so it will give benefits for anything that requires that, and it's just a downright good enchantment, assuming it does not get destroyed. Next up, we have our Planeswalkers, which is the versions of Nicol Bolas. So we have the version of Nicol Bolas, the Ravager, which if you pay the cost, he will transform into Nicol Bolas, the Arisen. And amongst the things that he does, you can reanimate things that you've destroyed. You can deal 10 damage to a creature or planeswalker. There's just a lot of versatility and spot removal there. Next up, we also have just plain old Nicol Bolas, because whenever he deals damage, your opponent discards his or her hand. And that's just a really effective control. Yes, he takes forever to get out. Yes, he has an upkeep cost. And yes, he's extremely vulnerable to spot removal, but it's just a downright good card. We also have Nicol Bolas Planeswalker. Again, this is where the spot removal comes in. We have destroy target non-creature permanent. We also have a -2 to gain control of target creature, so a creature that is obviously going to be a menace, we can just simply take it, and then his ulti is just really good. Then we have Nicol Bolas the Deceiver. One of the only reasons we're running this is because the mana rock, it's not nearly as effective as some of the other Nicol Bolases, but at the same time, it's just, you can search it up with the mana rock tutor, and so I felt like it was a good add. And it does have a -3 destroy target creature, draw a card, so we're still looking at spot removal. Next up, we have Nicol Bolas the God-Pharaoh. Again, just a downright good card. 7 damage to target opponent and creature. Each opponent exiles 2 cards from his or her hand, so we got a lot of control there. And then finally, we have Nicol Bolas, Dragon God, who has all the loyalty abilities of all other planeswalkers on the battlefield, including other Nicol Bolases. So, and then he also has destroy target creature or planeswalker, so he's got his spot removal in there as well. Next up, we're going to take a look at the board wipes that I did choose to keep in here. We have Blasphemous Act, because it gets cheaper with the number of creatures in play, and it deals 13 damage in total to all creatures. It's just very good. It won't take out big beefy things, but it's just a downright good board wipe. And then we have Last One Standing, just because it kind of feeds into that political funness. Only one creature is going to stay. It's a random choice, and everything else gets destroyed. And likely I'm not going to have that many creatures in play anyway. And then we're going to take a look at our spot removal that I did choose to keep. So we have the Bedevil, because again, I needed it to be versatile. We have destroy target artifact, creature, or planeswalker, so it hits multiple different targets. So I don't necessarily have to use it on a creature if I don't want to. And then we also have Dreadbore, which destroys target creature or planeswalker, which I think is just downright better than Terminate. Costs the same, does the same thing, except for the it can't regenerate part, which, it is what it is. And then finally, we have Fierce Guardianship. This is to counter a non-creature spell. It is probably the best counter non-creature non-creature spell that you can have. Because if you own your... Well, okay, one of the best. Because if you own your commander, it's free. So it's just a nice spell to have. And then the card that I chose that I thought was better than Thirst for Meaning in this is Perilous Research, which allows you to draw 2 cards, and then you just sacrifice a permanent. Obviously, we're looking at sacrificing the permanents, the curses that are attached to us, so it helps to get rid of any curses that I wasn't able to recycle onto my opponent with Lynde. Next up, we're going to take a look at the mana rocks that I have chosen for this deck. On those, let me just make sure I got this right. Yeah. So we have our Rakdos Signet, we have our Izzet Signet, and we have our Dimir Signet. They're just too good not to include. I wanted to put the talismans in here as well, for the reason that I could use the colorless mana to activate the signets when I didn't want to lose life for colored mana, but I chose... I had limited space, so I chose not to run them. Then we have the Visage of Bolas. This is the tutor mana rock that I was talking about. Creates the colors that I like, and it searches for the Bolas Deceiver. While it is very specific on which Bolas it searches for, because it creates the colors I need, and it really does search a Bolas, I felt like it was a good auto-include. Next up, we have the Chromatic Lantern. Chromatic Lantern is going to fix your mana problems once it's played, period. End of story. It's just a very good card. Not to mention, it helps to take care of anything that says you take damage when you tap it for mana. So everything but the City of Brass will start to be less painful. And then finally, we have Sol Ring, because it's Sol Ring. It's auto-include. You just have to have that. Next up, we're going to look at a couple of artifacts that I felt were necessary for a deck like this. We're using the Stuffy Doll. Stuffy Doll is indestructible. It deals damage back to your opponent for however much damage is being dealt to it. So it's a phenomenal blocker for anything that doesn't have trample. And it can deal damage to itself. So if worst case scenario comes that they haven't done anything to you, you can just tap it to deal damage to itself, so that it deals damage to whichever opponent you chose. This actually really pairs well with Silent Arbiter, the next one, which basically says that no more than one creature can attack each combat, and no more than one creature can block each combat. So it makes it de-incentivizes attacking me if I have the Stuffy Doll in play, because the damage is going to get reflected back at you. Or it could incentivize your opponent to attack you simply for the sake of getting it blocked by Stuffy Doll and dealing damage to the other opponent that the Stuffy Doll is chosen for. So it's just another one of those political intrigue things. Next up, we have the Cloud Key, and this was the card that I chose over the Nightscape Familiar, because it is specifically... spells of a chosen type cost 1 less, so I can choose enchantments and all my enchantments cost 1 less, whereas the Nightscape Familiar was just blue and red cards, and a majority of the deck is black, so it just seemed less effective than the Cloud Key, since a majority of the deck is enchantments. And then finally, we have Skull of Orm, which I chose to use instead of the Crystal Chimes, because I just don't see mass removal happening. And if it does, then it does. Skull of Orm helps me to get enchantments back from my graveyard every turn, even if it's just one at a time. Plus, it helps me target things like Captive Audience and Megrim and Puka's Mischief. So it's just, I think, all around for this particular deck and the opponents that I'm playing, probably the best choice. Next up, we're going to take a look at the creatures, and we're going to talk about why I chose them. So we have Xantcha, Sleeper Agent, and this plays into the whole, my opponent needs to be controlling a lot of permanents that I own. So Xantcha, first off, is just downright good to give to your opponent. It can't attack you. It cannot attack planeswalkers you own. It's a 5/5 body. And at any point in time, either you or the other opponents can pay 3 to make the controller of this lose 2 life and draw a card, which is just a really great ability. And it incentivizes a lot of this counterplay between opponents so that they're not focusing on you. Next up, we have Notion Thief. Because some of these curses allow your opponents to draw cards, and you do not want your opponents to get out of hand with the cards they're drawing, while I did not play Opposition Agent because I felt like it was too powerful, Notion Thief, I think, in this deck is just powerful enough where it shuts down your opponent's ability to draw and gives those draws to you. And it's really not because I want to shut down my opponent's abilities to draw cards with their cards. It's really because I'm trying to shut down the ability for them to draw cards off my curses, which is kind of a auxiliary happenstance. Next up, we have Bitterheart Witch. For obvious reasons. If she dies, she tutors for a curse. Then we have Dreamshaper Shaman. Dreamshaper Shaman is another one of those cards that allows me to recycle curses in a sense, because at the beginning of my end step, I can tap 2 in a red and sacrifice one of my non-land permanents, in this case a curse, to reveal cards from the top of my deck until I come across probably another curse and attach it to my opponent. I just thought this was a really good card. It has a big body, and while the cost is insane, in Commander it's not that big of a deal. Next up, we have Sage of Mysteries. This is one of the few Constellation cards that actually made it into the deck because it mills your opponent, and I have curses that deal with cards going into the graveyard during a turn, and so this just helps to amplify that. Next up, we have Doomwake Giant. Doomwake Giant is the card that I chose in place of the -2/-2 guy, because it gives -1/-1 to each creature your opponents control. And I think that that is a really effective way to wipe out an entire board of very small creatures. And depending on how many enchantments are being put into play on your side, it can be really effective even against mid-range creatures as well. So I felt like this was probably a better choice. Again, who knows? We'll see how it plays. Next up, we have Shimmerwing Chimera, because Shimmerwing Chimera says at the beginning of your upkeep, you can return up to 1 target enchantment you control to your owner's hand. So any enchantments any curses that you were not able to reassign to your opponents, you can pop back into your hand and replay onto your opponent. So just a way to help keep as many of those curses off of you as possible. Next up, we have Blim Comedic Genius, and Blim Comedic Genius is the reason that I want my opponent to own or to control a lot of permanents that I own. Blim Comedic Genius deals combat damage to a player. When it deals combat damage to a player, that player gains control of target opponent or target permanent you control, so you can get rid of those curses that you weren't able to get rid of via Lynde's ability or any other ability that I have in here. And then your opponent, or then each player loses life and discards cards equal to the number of permanents they control but don't own. So you can hit both of your opponents for the number of curses and or permanents that they own that they don't control, or that they control that they don't own. And then on top of that, it synergizes well with Megrim because they're discarding cards, so they're losing life from the card discard. So it's just, this is an auto include in this deck. You have to run it. Probably the MVP of this deck. Next up, we have Accursed Witch. Accursed Witch is in here for obvious reasons, because when she dies, she returns to the battlefield as a curse. So I feel like you just have to run her because she eventually does turn into a curse. She's a 4/2 body. It de-incentivizes your opponent to block it because they don't necessarily want it to die. So a 4/2 body is just downright good. And then finally, we have Tergrid. Tergrid, God of Fright. Your opponent is going to be spending a lot of time sacrificing and or discarding cards. And anytime they sacrifice and discard permanent cards while Tergrid is in play, you gain control of those. And that just is terrifying for this deck. And it really takes another level for how this deck plays. So this is a downright mean card to have in here. And that is the last of those cards. So that is my Lynde, Cheerful Tormentor, Curse deck commander deck list. Like I said, super casual. There are a ton of cards that I should definitely be playing that I did not add in here because I just feel like they're too good. There are several cards that I want to play in here, but until I've had a chance to really see how this deck plays, I can't figure out how to fit them just yet. But that is what I've run for my deck. If you have any comments below, or if you have any comments, please leave them below. Keep in mind, I'm removing any negative comments. Again, I said at the very beginning of this video, it wasn't meant to be anything more than a casual venture. This is not a competitive EDH deck. It is just a fun deck for me to have put together and play. If you have any suggestions, I would love to hear it. Maybe there's some cards that I missed that are probably really good for this deck. Maybe you know what I should take out and you've played a deck like this that I could sub in for other cards. Leave it below. I will definitely take a look at these comments, and I love to hear from you guys, so it would be great. Lastly, if you like the video, please like and subscribe. I do this in my free time, so it's just kind of nice to have the support for anybody who actually enjoys these videos. And consider backing me on Patreon. Check out my Patreon under Uncommon Ramen. Any amount of support I can get is more time that I can spend getting this content out there. So yeah, guys, Lynde Cheerful Tormentor commander deck. I will see what I can do about getting the deck list onto the description down below. And until next time, guys. Peace.